This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 13th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The Gospel of the Lord. So, throughout his earthly ministry, it seems that Jesus was often famous as a teacher, as a healer, and even as a miracle worker. But in spite of the fact that Jesus was always on the road and he seemed to go all over the place, he was never famous as a travel blogger. And today's gospel reading makes it clear why. Jesus and his disciples have traveled to Jerusalem and they go up onto the Temple Mount. Just a couple of decades before, Herod the Great had vastly expanded the footprint of the Temple Mount by hauling in these 40-ton cut stones, which were so perfectly fitted together that they didn't even need mortar. He built a massive retaining wall and backfilled it to an area that was beyond what anyone ever thought was possible. He had renovated and enlarged the temple so that, in fact, people from all over the Roman Empire came to see this impressive sight, even if they had no particular connection to Judaism. Now, while the disciples in Mark's Gospel are generally portrayed as clueless and usually wrong about stuff, this time they're right. Those stones were large. The buildings were impressive, even by Roman standards. And although the Romans later completely destroyed the temple, the retaining wall and the Temple Mount are still there today, and they're still impressive. But in today's gospel reading, Jesus throws cold water on it all. "Do you see these great buildings?" Jesus asks. "All will be thrown down." And later in the evening, when the disciples ask him about this, things sound even worse. Wars and rumors of wars are coming. Famines, earthquakes. Beware that you're not led astray. Now, in some ways, it's not terribly prophetic to predict that eventually buildings will come down. Given enough time, almost all of them will. And it's not prescient to predict that wars and rumors of wars will come. Sadly, that happens all the time. And people have tried and still try to lead others astray in a variety of ways. Beware is not a new warning. But then Jesus goes on to say something that seems to make no intuitive sense. After telling his disciples about all of these terrible and scary things, he says, "Do not be alarmed." Do not be alarmed. Really? How can we not be alarmed by all of these things? We hear about this stuff all the time, and we are always told that these things should alarm us. Indeed, it often feels like we live in a state of perpetual alarm. We are repeatedly told that all kinds of things should alarm us, and there are often reasons for that, both good and bad. Politicians on both sides tell us that we should be alarmed by the outrageous and crazy stuff that somebody on the other side said or did. But in a country where barely more than half of us vote, if my side can get alarmed enough, it might drive up the vote. And so we are always told that we need to be alarmed. Our news feeds always lead with stories about all of the things that should shock and alarm us. The latest outrage, tragedy, or example of corruption. It's good, of course, that we know about all these things, but we also know that they're clickbait. They drive views and advertising revenue. And so there's always also a financial incentive to tell people what they should be alarmed about. And sometimes even charitable organizations seem to depend upon people being alarmed by the magnitude of suffering and injustice. I see this frequently when organizations send me stuff, even ones that I love and work with, like the ELCA Disaster Relief. It's a great organization. We support it, and we should. But they have always loved to send out these things that they are called disastergrams. And they used to be little postcards you would get in the mail, but now they're emails and things like that. And they tell us about all kinds of stuff going on in the world that I usually know about already, but they also almost always tell me that the enormity of the suffering and the terrible tragedy is even worse than I could imagine. And this is supposed to be alarming because it's intended to raise money and help people, and it's a good cause. But still, often when I read appeals from organizations that I want to support, I realize also that sometimes alarming people is a good fundraising strategy. And yet, the thing about living in a constant state of alarm is that it's distracting from everything else that's going on around you. It's exhausting and saps the emotional energy you have to engage on any issue. And it's demoralizing because many of these alarming messages portend that if you are not constantly alarmed about this thing that you should be alarmed about, the world as you know it will literally end. And into the midst of all of this, Jesus says, do not be alarmed. And when he says that, he does not say, don't pay attention to the problems in the world. He doesn't say, don't care about the suffering of others. And he doesn't even say, don't take reasonable precautions to avoid danger to your own life. Later, if you read past verse 8, which we read this morning, you'll see Jesus says, the days are coming when you're going to have to flee from Jerusalem because it's going to be under siege. Take notice of this. But in telling his first disciples and us not to be alarmed, Jesus is calling us to be people who do not get so distracted by the crisis du jour that we're unable to see or focus on what God is calling us to do in this particular moment. The disciples in today's reading have followed Jesus into Jerusalem at the beginning of what we call Holy Week. They are about to be involved in the death and resurrection of Jesus and sent into the world with the good news of the resurrection. But at the moment, they're too distracted to notice any of that because they're wondering about the temple. When is the temple going to fall down? What's the sign this is going to be accomplished? And they miss out on what God is calling them to do and to be part of in that actual moment. Don't be alarmed means don't miss out on what God is doing with you and in your life right now and how God is calling you to make a difference in this moment. It's true for me, and maybe this is for you also, that when I'm thinking too much about the big headlines of the day, which frankly I can't do a whole lot about, I lose focus on what God may be calling me to do or to notice right here and right now. So Jesus calls his disciples and us not to be alarmed. He's calling us to be people who resist becoming exhausted by the constant drama and trauma that the world feeds us. Jesus always called his disciples, and he calls us to help those who are suffering in the world around us. But there will always be more than we can do, and our own efforts will often seem insignificant. That's why it's always good to remember that it is Jesus who saves the world, not us. And that can free us then to use our energy and to use our abilities to make a difference, to do the things that God actually empowers us to do, instead of exhausting our energy in a constant state of alarm. And when Jesus called his first disciples, and when Jesus calls us not to be alarmed, he's calling us to be people who remember that the alarming thing that's going on around us, whether it's social, political, or my own personal trauma, is not the end. That's finally the thing that Jesus gets to at the end of this passage. All of these things, the temple falling down, the famines, the earthquakes, the wars, the rumors of war, this is not the end. even when at the moment it might seem like it. This, whatever this is, may be bad and painful and even seem like the end. But Jesus promises that the end of all things is finally in God's hands. The end is when God brings about a new world where there are no more alarming things. And even the end for us is not death, but new life. Jesus told his first disciples that the temple coming down, the wars, the rumors of wars, and whatever else would not be the end, and it wasn't. God had more to come. And God has more to come for all of us as well. I try to remember that. I am not always good at that, but I try to remember that whenever I face situations in my life where I go, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I can't imagine how we go on from here. Like this feels like the end. To remind myself, no, this is not the end. This really is not the end. God has more in store for me. God has more in store for you. There is life beyond whatever the alarming thing is at this moment. And when we know that and remember that, we're able to engage in whatever alarming thing is happening without losing hope. Do not be alarmed, says Jesus, because God really is doing something with you and around you that's worth noticing. Do not be alarmed, says Jesus, because if you are, you'll end up wasting your energy on the drama and the trauma instead of on the things that God is calling you to do that really make a difference. And do not be alarmed, says Jesus, because as bad as things may seem, this is not the end. And the end, when it comes, is in God's hands, and God's end for you and for the whole world is the reality of resurrection and new life. Amen.